these larger nations of Europe are really eyeing some of the smaller nations for expansion. Now, we've kind of seen this pattern before, where some of these smaller nations are very much on the menu. They might be the next colonial gobbled up nation that these bigger empires are looking to expand into. Now, I do just kind of want to point out one thing real fast. As Serbia becomes one of these key little nations that has a very serious reason as to why they should be nervous. Serbia's on the menu. Austria-Hungary is an old empire that is looking to expand, and their expansion ideas are looking south. Now, I know it's kind of hard to see here, but there are several smaller nations within southeastern Europe that have reason to be nervous. Austria-Hungary is looking to expand its borders and gobble up Serbia, so they need help, and they need it right now. They look to an old protector of theirs. They look to a nation, to an empire, that has a similar ethnic background. In Western Russia live a gigantic collection of Slavic people. Those Slavic people in Western Russia identify with the people of Serbia. They're Slavs as well. Russia tells Serbia, we promise we will protect you against any Austro-Hungarian expansion. Now, I do want to say this. Yes, the Russians are looking out for Serbia. They are looking to protect them. But it's not their only interest. Forever, Russia has a big problem in that they don't have access to a warm water port. Most of the year, all of the Russian ports are frozen solid, which makes it real hard to have an international navy. If they're going to break out of their frozen ports, they need access to the Mediterranean Sea. What do we see about Serbia and why this would be a nice step for the Russians to ally themselves with tiny little Serbia? What do you think the Russians have planned? Carla, what do you think?
It's pretty close. A little bit.
Excellent. They're a nice little causeway into the Mediterranean. And like I say, all of this is going to play out more as we go forward. But what we need to do today is talk about our next big cause. We got to talk about how imperialism is going to be one of these gigantic causes. Now, we have talked about imperialism before. In fact, it's the first half of this entire unit as we dabble in imperialism. Taking colonies, becoming an empire, is kind of like steroids. Taking these little colonies and having these new markets and having their raw materials can make an empire big and strong and competitive. And when you have a little bit, you want more. Just like a steroid, though, more is going to make you bigger and stronger and more competitive. But you have to be careful not to go too far. We see this imperialism game rearing its head once again, but it's going to come with a new world player. In 1871, Europe has a big problem. In 1871, there used to be all of these divided German states. Multiple little nations that were all made up of Germanic people, the biggest one being Prussia. By 1871, these little German states have been getting very frustrated competing against each other, and Prussia sends out really this kind of delegation saying, instead of competing against one another, we should unite. We should make a greater Germany. With the stroke of a pen, overnight, poof, Germany's made. Quite literally. It didn't exist one day, and it does exist the next. Germany, with the stroke of a pen, becomes the biggest industrial power in Europe. Now, I want to just kind of give you a little analogy because I'm going to come back to this. If all of a sudden, if today, just an island just sprang up out of the Pacific off the coast of California and just immediately had way more industrial might than the United States, would you be a little nervous? Should you be nervous? All of a sudden, Europe now has a brand new power. And that new power says, all of you have colonies. I want colonies as well. The Germans are going to take their colonies in Asia. They take their colonies in Africa. Again, like a steroid, they take a little bit, and it makes them big and strong and competitive. And when they have a little bit of that, what do they want? More. They start taking more and more colonies around the world. And as we've talked about before, if you want to be an international power, if you want to have colonies, you better have a military that can provide for that. You better have a massive military complex, one that's big enough to, one, control your colonies, and also defend your colonies, because you're gonna have competitors. Now, the way the Germans do imperialism is a little bit different from some of their competitors. The Germans, for years and years previous to this, have always considered themselves to be a land power. They have huge investments in their army. They have huge armies. But if you're going to be a world power, you can't just put money in the army. What else do you have to have? You better have a navy as well. We're going to see the Germans, yes, continue to put huge amounts of money towards their military. As they do take their little colonies, they have their first small taste of imperialism steroids. They get bigger, and they get bigger, and they get stronger. So now I have to go back to my little analogy. Today, an island pops up out of the Pacific. It's right next to California. They're the biggest industrial power in the world. Should we be nervous? Oh, Mercy, should we be nervous? Now they want to be the biggest military in the world. And this island says, United States, your time is over. Now we're going to be the biggest military power on the planet. Does that make you nervous? I would hope so. We now have this new nation in Europe telling these other established empires, we are going to be a massive military force. We are going to take our own colonies throughout the world. It's time for you to step aside. There is something that the Germans are going to do that's going to allow them to expand and become huge and become massive and become strong, basically all but immediately. The Germans are going to start military conscription. The Germans are going to institute a military draft, where basically every German male between the ages of 18 to 40 can now serve in the military. Now, let me kind of explain a couple of things, because really up until about 50 years before this kind of thing didn't exist. You would never, ever have conscription. So I kind of have to go backwards and talk about a couple of things we've discussed to explain what the Europeans are up to. I'm forgetting, I don't think it was this class, I think it was another class. When we were talking about the Civil War, and we saw that in the South there are millions of slaves. And someone, like I said, I don't think it was in here, I think it was another class, but I forget. Someone said, well, why don't you bring the slaves into the Confederate Army? Why don't you arm them? I said, Because that's a horrible idea. What's the problem if the Confederate States armed the slaves and brought them into the Confederate Army? What are they going to do? I can't see why that's such a terrible idea.
The Confederates are fighting to keep their slaves.
So what are the slaves going to do?
Fight to be slaves again? No, they're going to kill them.
They're going to take the weapons you just gave them and turn them back on you. That's a horrible idea. The Europeans, for basically the last 500 years before this, have had a system in place where about 98% of the European population are serfs. They're farmers that are tied to the land, and they are basically owned by nobility, by aristocracy, by dukes and duchesses and kings and queens. If you arm these people that are farmers working on your land, what are they going to do? They're going to turn against you. Ever since we have Napoleon's rise to power in Europe, things have changed. Now we have citizen soldiers, people who have a vested interest in the strength of their empire. People who are told, you're part of the greater empire. You're not a serf. You're an independent. You have autonomy. You can do whatever you want. Come and fight for the empire. Now, we were talking before about how at its absolute biggest, the most you could do, even if you got really lucky, the biggest army the Roman Empire could ever actually put on the field is maybe 50,000 men. Maybe. Now you have these empires conscripting men, and their armies are 1 million men, 2 million men, 7 million men. Now we have empires that can take a punch, that have vastly increased their military power. Just their numbers are astronomical. Now again, I kind of have to go backwards again. Remember we were talking about Antietam? 23,000 casualties in one day. And as Antietam is dragging on, Robert E. Lee said, I have one decision to make. I have to fall back. I can't sustain these kind of losses. Now we have armies of 7 million men. Can they sustain losses like 23,000 in a day? We're going to see one particular commander that says, you can't stop me. I'm willing to give 20,000 men per week. His opponent, another general on the other side, is going to say, you underestimate me. I'm willing to sacrifice 50,000 of my men per week. For 4 years, the numbers are just astronomical as these militaries have gotten so huge. There's only one thing you can do. Keep expanding. Now, like I say, the Germans always thought of themselves as a land power. But if you're going to be an international empire, you better have a good navy. The Germans look at their competition in Europe, and they see very clearly there is one nation that always has the best navy. Who always has the best navy?
America.
Not yet.
Okay.
The Brits always have the best navy. Always, always, always.
They have
Because
a lot
the
of
Brits
water around them.
are an island. You better have a good navy. In fact, it doesn't make any sense to invest in the army if you are on an island. The Brits have made some of the finest battleships in all the world. Oh, a perfect British name. Do you remember? You guys read about it. They call these ships, and it basically is fear nothing. The dreadnoughts. The best battleships on Earth. The Germans want in on the game. So they look at the best navy on Earth and simply say, just copy them. We want our own dreadnoughts. They have the industry to build them. So the Germans make their own. They have 12 massive battleships. Huge. Basically the exact same as the dreadnoughts. Now, if you're the British Empire,